They say some of the deepest wounds are not carved with knives or bullets but with silence, with subtle gestures that slice through dignity. The scene is ordinary on the surface, a grand event, the kind where suits gleam under soft lights and every handshake carries the weight of invisible contracts. The air is perfumed with power and expectation. And in this sea of prestige, one man sat in his rightful place, a black CEO whose work, intellect, and determination had earned him the VIP seat he occupied. It was more than a chair, it was a symbol, a recognition of countless hours spent climbing a ladder that was never built for him. Yet, as quiet as a whisper, the shift happened. A hand on his shoulder, a polite smile stretched too thin, words coated with false courtesy. They told him there had been a mistake, that his seat wasn't meant for him after all. He was asked, no, instructed, to move, to slide into a space less visible, less radiant, less important. And as he stood, as he walked from the center of the room to its margins, the act seemed small to the casual observer. A change of chairs. Nothing more. But for him, and for anyone who has ever been told silently that they don't belong, it was a removal far louder than any shout. The cruelty lay not in the command itself but in its disguise. No one said he didn't deserve to be there. No one uttered the truth that clung like smoke in the air, that his skin, his presence, his very existence in that seat disrupted the image they wanted to preserve. Instead, they wrapped their rejection in civility, dressed their prejudice in polite tones. That's how bias often operates, hidden behind smiles, veiled by rules that shift like shadows depending on who dares to claim the spotlight. And as he sat in the new seat, stripped of the vantage point he had rightfully earned, he carried the weight of what had just been taken. It wasn't just about placement in a room, it was about erasure. To the rest of the crowd, the story would be forgotten by the time the next glass of champagne was poured. But for him, that small act replayed in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. Every detail seared into memory, the way the usher avoided his eyes, the faint smirk of someone who watched with satisfaction, the uncomfortable shuffle of guests who saw and chose silence over protest. What they failed to understand was that these small acts of removal carry legacies. Every moment like this ties itself to history, to centuries of being told to stand at the back, to wait one's turn, to accept less when more has already been earned. They thought they had shifted him out of sight, that the matter ended once he was seated elsewhere. But the insult became a mirror, showing the fragility of their power, and the resilience it would ignite in him. The silent removal was not just a single event but a statement, intentional or not, about where they believed he belonged. It was a lesson in how discrimination often disguises itself in the ordinary. There were no loud accusations, no harsh words. Just the cold precision of exclusion, performed so quietly that those responsible could later deny any wrongdoing. That's the cruelty of it. The ability to wound while pretending nothing happened. For him, the humiliation was not in losing a chair but in the confirmation of what he had always suspected, that success, no matter how grand, would never shield him completely from prejudice. The degree on his wall, the empire he built, the respect he commanded in boardrooms, none of it could protect him from a system that looked first at his skin before acknowledging his achievements. In that moment, the seat was no longer just wood and fabric. It became the stage on which their bias was performed, an artifact of who they believed deserved visibility, and who did not. But the removal also sparked clarity. If they could so easily take from him a seat he had rightfully earned, then it was never about merit. It was about maintaining an illusion, guarding a hierarchy in which his presence was disruptive. And while they thought they had diminished him, what they truly did was reveal themselves. Every time he replayed that moment, he saw not his own weakness but their fear, the fear of a man who carried both excellence and difference, and the power that comes when those two meet. The silence that followed was almost unbearable. Conversations carried on, laughter filled the air, glasses clinked, and yet beneath it all lay the sharp awareness that something ugly had taken place. It wasn't spoken of, wasn't acknowledged, but it lingered. He could feel it pressing against him, the weight of invisibility imposed upon him in a room where he should have been most visible. The irony cut deep. He had been celebrated as a visionary, praise for leadership, yet in the moment when recognition mattered most, he was displaced as if his presence threatened the very order of things. This removal was not an isolated story. It was part of a pattern repeated in countless rooms, in countless ways, where doors opened just wide enough for someone to enter but not wide enough for them to stay at the center. And though the act itself seemed small, it spoke volumes about power, about privilege, about the fragile balance that some are desperate to protect. It wasn't just about where he sat, it was about what his presence symbolized: a breaking of boundaries, a rewriting of narratives, a challenge to the unspoken rules that keep certain faces at the margins. The weight of a title is often spoken about as if it carries unshakable authority, as though a few words on a business card or a plaque on an office door are enough to silence doubt and command respect. A title is supposed to be proof, a crystallization of years of work, sacrifices, choices, and victories. For the man at the heart of this story, the title of CEO was not just bestowed upon him. It was carved out of relentless struggle, sharpened by discipline, and secured through triumphs in spaces where the odds were stacked against him. Every milestone was a rebuttal to the voices that had once whispered that someone like him could not lead. Every achievement was a testament to his brilliance and resilience. Yet, in that pivotal moment, when he was asked to leave his rightful seat, the truth revealed itself with brutal clarity. A title is powerful, but in the face of prejudice, it can be made to weigh nothing at all. He carried the weight of Chief Executive Officer with a kind of quiet dignity. To be a CEO is to be a leader, a decision-maker, someone trusted with vision and authority. In theory, that position places you above trivial dismissals, beyond the reach of casual disrespect. Yet in that room, surrounded by peers who knew his accomplishments, the title did not shield him. It became paper-thin, fragile against the invisible forces of bias that judged not his qualifications but the color of his skin. It was as though all the battles he had won, all the respect he had earned, collapsed in a single gesture that told him, "Your title does not protect you here." There is a particular sting in that kind of realization. For years he had believed that the ladder of success was built on merit, that if he climbed high enough, no one could question his place. The title was supposed to be the ultimate armor, a shield to block prejudice, and a crown to signify belonging. But instead, it revealed itself to be conditional, its value dependent not on his achievements but on whether those around him chose to acknowledge it. In that room, they saw not a CEO but a man who did not fit the image of who they thought a CEO should be. His authority, his leadership, his vision, all invisible under the weight of assumptions that had nothing to do with his record and everything to do with his identity. It is one thing to face open opposition, to hear words of doubt or resistance spoken aloud. It is another to encounter the quiet dismissal that strips away respect while pretending nothing has changed. His title, which should have guaranteed his rightful place, became a hollow decoration when others decided it no longer mattered. The irony was sharp. He was the highest authority in his own company, a man whose decisions influenced markets and shaped futures, yet in that room, among others with equal or lesser achievements, his authority was ignored as though it were an illusion. The weight of a title is not just personal, it carries the expectations of everyone who looks to it as proof of possibility. For many who watched him, his position as CEO represented more than his own success. It was a symbol of doors opening, of boundaries breaking. To see him dismissed despite that title was to be reminded of how fragile progress can feel, how easily recognition can be stripped away when power decides to look the other way. His struggle was not only his own but also tied to a larger story of countless individuals who rise, excel, and still find themselves treated as though their achievements are negotiable. The contradiction was unbearable. On paper, his authority was absolute. In reality, it was disregarded in an instant. The lesson was as bitter as it was clear. Titles can open doors, but they cannot force others to respect you if their hearts are closed. Respect, when filtered through prejudice, becomes conditional, granted only when it serves the comfort of those in control. His presence in that VIP seat was an undeniable fact of his earned status, but their reaction revealed that to them, the title was not enough. And so, the weight of his title pressed heavily upon him. Not because it lacked meaning, but because it carried with it the disappointment of betrayal. He had believed in its power, believed that reaching this height would shield him from such moments. Instead, he found himself reminded that a title alone cannot dismantle bias. It can declare who you are, but it cannot always force the world to honor it. The room reminded him that his place was not guaranteed by letters after his name, but was constantly subject to silent challenges that had nothing to do with merit. The burden of holding that title, then, was twofold. On one side, it was the pride of accomplishment, the proof of his journey. On the other, it was the crushing awareness that even with the highest recognition of leadership, he could still be reduced, still be told to move, still be treated as though his identity overshadowed his authority. That is the cruel paradox. The higher the title, the heavier the fall when it is disregarded, because the expectation of respect is greater, and the sting of its absence cuts deeper. The room may have seen only a man move from one seat to another, but he felt the full weight of what had just happened. The title of CO, earned through blood and brilliance, had been made invisible. The authority it symbolized dissolved into the background. And in that invisibility lay the painful truth that respect, when denied, can make even the most powerful title feel like nothing at all. The moment of humiliation could have ended there, left as a bitter memory to be swallowed down, but it did not. There comes a point in every story of injustice when silence hardens into resolve, when the sting of being wrong transforms into fuel for something greater. That night, as he sat away from the place he had earned, every second deepened his awareness that what had happened was more than a personal slight. It was a revelation, a spark that lit up the truth he had long carried. No amount of success would make him immune to prejudice, but no amount of prejudice could erase the force of his success. That realization became the turning point, the exact instant when his humiliation shifted into determination, when what was meant to diminish him instead awakened the resolve to teach a lesson they would never forget. It is often said that moments of great change are not loud but quiet, taking place within a single heart. For him, the turning point was not a speech, not a confrontation, not an outburst. It was the steady gathering of will inside his chest, a decision forming like steel beneath the surface. They had tried to shrink him, to make him invisible in a room where he was supposed to shine, but instead they had revealed the truth of their own fragility. By attempting to exclude him, they had shown exactly why his presence was necessary, why his leadership mattered, why his story had to be told. That was the paradox of the insult. What was meant to silence him only gave him more reason to speak. The human spirit bends differently under pressure. Some are crushed, some retreat, but others grow sharper, more precise, more unyielding. He chose the latter. His turning point was not anger unleashed but anger harnessed, not rage that destroyed but focus that built. He understood that retaliation would not come from shouting or storming out of the room. It would come from proving beyond doubt that the chair they had taken from him did not define his worth. It would come from showing that power does not lie in where you are seated but in the influence you command, in the vision you embody, in the resilience you refuse to abandon. In that moment, he began to see clearly the larger picture. The removal from his seat was not just about him. It was about the structures that had, for generations, made such moments possible. He saw the faces of those who had been told they were not enough, the countless stories of people pushed aside despite their brilliance, and he realized that his turning point was not just personal but collective. He carried the weight of their voices, and with it came the unshakable decision that this lesson would not end in silence. He would turn what was meant to humiliate into a story of transformation, a reminder that dignity cannot be taken by force, only surrendered, and he was not about to surrender. The turning point also came with a kind of stillness. He did not let his mind race with questions of why or how. He knew the answer. The act had been done because his presence disrupted the story others wanted to tell. They wanted him on the sidelines, framed as exceptional but not central, celebrated from a distance but not seen as equal. And in seeing their fears so plainly, he felt his own strength solidify. Their attempt to diminish him revealed his ability to unsettle them, to challenge what they considered normal, to make them confront truths they preferred to hide. That recognition became his anchor, the foundation of his resolve. What follows a turning point is not always immediate action but a transformation of perspective. For him, it was the realization that his life had been preparing him for this kind of moment all along. Every barrier he had broken, every room he had entered where no one expected him to be, had been a rehearsal for this. Each challenge had taught him not only how to endure but how to respond. And now, with clarity, he knew that the greatest response would not be in words spoken in anger but in actions that could not be denied. The turning point was his shift from victim to strategist, from target to teacher, from excluded to unforgettable. He also began to recognize that moments like these have power beyond the individual. To the casual observer, it was simply a reassignment of seats, an error corrected with polite words. To him, it was the unveiling of a truth that many pretended did not exist. And in knowing that, he understood the importance of carrying the story forward, not just as his own but as a reflection of countless others. His humiliation became a kind of fuel, not because he wanted revenge in its simplest form, but because he knew the story had the power to expose the very bias that sought to erase him. The turning point, then, was the decision to own the narrative, to refuse to let it vanish into silence, to turn the act of dismissal into the beginning of a lesson. It is easy to think of turning points as dramatic, as if lightning strikes and everything shifts in an instant. But often they come quietly, like the slow but certain rising of the sun. That was how his resolve formed, steadily, unshakably, until it filled him completely. The humiliation still stung, the injustice still burned, but beneath it all grew the certainty that the story was not over. The seat they had taken from him was temporary. The lesson he would teach in return would be permanent. The strategy of patience is often misunderstood, mistaken for passivity, as though waiting is the same as doing nothing. But patience, in the hands of someone who has been underestimated, becomes a weapon sharper than anger, a tool that cuts deeper than impulsive retaliation. For him, the moment of humiliation could have been met with an outburst, a loud protest in front of the room, but he knew such a reaction would only confirm the very stereotypes that had been used to justify moving him. They wanted him to appear emotional, reactive, unprofessional, anything that could be used to dismiss his worth. Instead, he chose silence in that instant, not because he had accepted the injustice, but because he understood that the best lessons are taught when they cannot be ignored, when they unfold in such undeniable clarity that no one can escape their impact. That choice was the beginning of his strategy. Patience, for him, was not passive endurance but active observation. He watched the room, the way eyes slid away from his, the way whispers traveled faster than truth, the way smiles failed to cover complicity. He memorized every detail, not to brood, but to build. Each glance, each smirk, each false courtesy became part of the ledger he kept quietly within himself, a record of the injustice that had taken place. Where others saw a moment quickly forgotten, he saw material for a lesson that would one day demand to be remembered. His patience allowed him to step back, to see the full shape of what had happened, and to plan a response that would echo far longer than any outburst in that room could have. It takes discipline to let go of the desire for immediate revenge, to resist the pull of pride that demands instant correction. For him, the discipline came from years of navigating spaces that were never designed to welcome him. He had learned that every reaction carried weight, that every response could be twisted into a weapon against him. And so, when the insult burned hottest, he swallowed it, not because he was weak, but because he knew that anger, when delayed, could become something far stronger, an act of justice that no one could dismiss. The patience he chose was not silence but strategy, a way of channeling his rage into action that would outlast the moment. This patience also gave him clarity. By refusing to react immediately, he was able to see more than just his own pain. He could see the systems at work, the patterns repeating themselves in different faces and different rooms. He saw that what had happened to him was not unique but part of a larger truth, that success did not always protect against prejudice, that authority could be ignored when it wore the wrong skin. And in seeing that, his response grew larger than himself. His strategy of patience was not simply about proving his own worth but about showing the world the truth of what had been done, about making the invisible visible through actions that no one could deny. Patience allowed him to prepare. Instead of reacting in the moment, he planned for the future, knowing that the best revenge is not a single act but a series of undeniable successes that expose the weakness of those who tried to diminish you. He poured his energy back into his work, into his vision, into building something so strong that it could not be erased by a single act of dismissal. Each decision he made afterward carried the quiet fire of that moment, the determination to show not only that he belonged in that VIP seat but that he was capable of reshaping the entire room. He understood that time was his ally, that every success he achieved afterward would make the memory of his removal all the more damning. Patience, in this sense, was not about waiting for things to change, but about creating the conditions in which his response would matter most. He refused to let the insult control the narrative. Instead, he built his own, step by step, until the story no longer belonged to those who had tried to push him aside but to him, the man who had turned silence into strategy. Every move he made after that night was deliberate, measured, designed not only to reclaim his dignity but to hold a mirror to those who thought they could deny it. There is also power in letting others underestimate you. His patience allowed them to believe they had succeeded, that by moving him they had silenced him. But beneath that calm exterior, he was preparing. He knew that underestimation is often the greatest gift an opponent can give, because it blinds them to the force that is quietly gathering. They dismissed him, and in doing so, they gave him the space to prepare the lesson that would one day confront them with undeniable truth. His patience was the shield behind which he sharpened his response, the quiet before the storm that would not be ignored. He also understood that true lessons are not taught in the heat of the moment, but in the lasting impact of what follows. If he had exploded with anger that night, the story would have been about his reaction, not about their prejudice. By choosing patience, he shifted the focus away from himself and onto the act itself, making it clear who had wronged whom. Over time, his actions would rewrite the narrative, ensuring that the lesson they learned was not about his temper but about their injustice. That is the brilliance of patience. It allows the truth to rise without distortion, to stand on its own, undeniable and complete. The moment of reckoning does not arrive suddenly, though to those caught unprepared, it often feels like an ambush. For him, it came with the slow, deliberate unveiling of truth, carried not in fiery speeches but in undeniable proof. The public reckoning was never about vengeance alone. It was about making visible what others had tried to hide in plain sight. Those who had moved him from his seat believed the matter would fade with the evening, that a small humiliation would vanish beneath the glamour of the event. But humiliation is not so easily buried, and truth has a way of resurfacing when patience and persistence carry it forward. His response had been carefully measured, each step a quiet preparation, until the day arrived when their actions could no longer be ignored or excused. The reckoning began with his work, with results so extraordinary that no one could deny them. Each success was a rebuke, each achievement a reminder that he had not only belonged in that VIP seat but had deserved it more than most. What they had tried to make invisible, he made undeniable. His vision, his leadership, his ability to turn challenges into triumphs, all of it became too powerful to dismiss. And with every new accomplishment, the memory of that night sharpened, transforming from a private wound into a public symbol of how bias had tried, and failed, to eclipse greatness. Reckoning is rarely loud at first. It is the gradual shift of perception, the quiet murmur that grows until it becomes a chorus too strong to silence. For him, it was the shift in how others began to speak his name, with respect that could no longer be withheld, with acknowledgement that grew heavier the more they had tried to deny it before. Those who had once looked away were forced to look directly at him, and in their gaze was the silent admission of what they had done. The reckoning was not just about proving them wrong. It was about holding them accountable to a truth they could no longer escape. The public nature of this reckoning made it all the more powerful. What had been done in a room filled with polished smiles now stood exposed under the light of undeniable reality. He did not need to remind people of the slight. His rise reminded them for him. Each headline, each award, each moment of recognition carried with it the unspoken story of the night he had been told to move. The contrast between the attempted erasure and his undeniable prominence created a narrative that could not be ignored. The reckoning was built not on his words but on the stark difference between their dismissal and his success. There is a kind of justice in seeing the truth play out so plainly. Those who had tried to silence him had given him the very stage on which their actions would be judged. Their attempt to remove him from sight had only made his eventual prominence shine brighter. The reckoning, then, was not only about his triumph but about their exposure. They had shown the world who they were, and he had shown the world who he was, and the contrast left no room for denial. This reckoning also stretched beyond the individuals involved. It became a story larger than one man, a reflection of the countless times others had been told to move, to shrink, to accept less than they had earned. His story became their story, and in his triumph, they found validation. The public reckoning was not only for him but for everyone who had ever been diminished, a reminder that injustice cannot always hide behind politeness, that truth eventually surfaces no matter how carefully it is buried. His victory became a collective one, his lesson a mirror held up to a society that too often pretends not to see. The reckoning carried a particular weight because it was not delivered in bitterness. He had not shouted, had not demanded vengeance in the moment. Instead, he allowed time and truth to do the work, and when the reckoning came, it was all the more powerful because it was undeniable. It was not fueled by anger but by the sheer force of his excellence, by results that silenced every excuse. Those who had once whispered doubts now spoke admiration, and in their words, whether they admitted it or not, was the taste of regret. There is no spectacle in this kind of justice, no need for dramatic confrontation. The reckoning lay in the simple fact that their actions, meant to diminish him, had instead elevated him. Their attempt to define his place had failed, and the lesson was etched into the story that unfolded around them. The more he rose, the smaller their actions became, until what they had done was not just remembered but judged in the harsh light of hindsight. The reckoning was not his burden to carry, it became theirs, a legacy of prejudice exposed by the very man they had tried to erase. Legacy is not always written in statues or carved into stone. Sometimes it is etched in the memories of those who witnessed a moment and never forgot its lesson. For him, the lasting legacy was never about reclaiming a single seat in a single room, but about rewriting the very idea of who deserved to sit there. The incident of his removal could have been reduced to one man's humiliation, a story whispered briefly and then lost in time, but instead it became the foundation of something greater. What they intended as erasure became a reminder that dignity, once defended and proven, can ripple far beyond the walls where it was first denied. The seat was only a chair, but what it represented grew into a legacy that no hand could take away. The legacy began in the silence he chose that night, the restraint that gave his response its strength. By refusing to meet humiliation with outbursts, he turned the focus away from himself and onto the act itself. That patience became part of his story, a demonstration that power lies not in reacting but in controlling the narrative. His silence was not weakness but intention, and years later, when the story was retold, that choice became a defining piece of his legacy, the leader who responded not with fury but with strategy, and who allowed time and truth to amplify his voice. As his career continued, the legacy grew with every success that could not be denied. Each accomplishment became more than personal victory. It was a reminder to those who had seen him displaced that their attempt to minimize him had failed. His name was spoken in rooms larger than the one where he had been dismissed. His influence extended into industries, communities, and conversations that reached far beyond the walls of that single event. The legacy was not only his rise but the shadow it cast backward, forcing people to remember the injustice that had tried and failed to contain him. What made the legacy last was not only his achievements, but the way he carried others with him. He understood that his story was not isolated, that countless others faced the same dismissal in different forms. His triumph became proof for them, evidence that exclusion could not define destiny. By opening doors, mentoring others, and ensuring that the next generation would not have to fight the same battles alone, he turned his personal story into a collective one. That is where legacy lives, not in the solitary rise of one individual but in the paths paved for those who come after. The image of that night, the removal from his seat, did not vanish, but over time it transformed. Instead of humiliation, it became a symbol of resistance, a marker in the story of a man who refused to be defined by the prejudice of others. When people spoke of him, they did not only speak of his title or his accomplishments, but of the dignity with which he carried that moment. The legacy was in the memory itself, in the way people retold the story not as an ending but as a beginning. His patience, his resolve, his eventual triumph became inseparable from the insult that had sparked them, until the act of dismissal no longer belonged to those who had committed it but to him, who had turned it into proof of resilience. The lasting legacy also resided in the lesson it taught about visibility. They had tried to make him invisible in that room, to move him out of sight, but in doing so they had made him unforgettable. His story carried a weight that no seat, no title, no single act of recognition could equal.